Look at this aerial photograph. A quiet Seattle neighborhood. Houses, lawns, parked cars, streets, trees. Ordinary suburb, ordinary morning. Except there is no ground beneath any of it. Those houses sit on a flat industrial rooftop. The trees are wire and painted fabric. The cars do not move. Below that fake neighborhood, inside a building covering 26 acres, tens of thousands of workers are assembling the most important bomber in American history. The war ended. The fake town came down. But what the factory left in the river below it is still being cleaned today. Nobody talks about that part. The photograph comes from U.S. Army Archives. It was taken over Seattle's south waterfront in 1943, and without context, you would have no reason to suspect anything. The streets are plausible. The houses look proportionate. The neighborhood appears asleep in the way real neighborhoods do in the early morning. The man responsible for that illusion was not a military engineer. He was John Stuart Detley, an art director from MGM Studios in Hollywood. Detley spent his career constructing visible lies, fake storefronts, dressed interiors, sets built exactly real enough to make an audience believe. When the Army came looking for someone to hide a working bomber factory in early 1942, they went to the film industry. Detley brought Hollywood logic to a military problem and built a neighborhood because that was what his entire career had trained him to produce. The factory he was hired to conceal was Boeing Plant 2 on East Marginal Way South, running beside the Duwamish River in Seattle's South Industrial District. Boeing had opened Plant 2 in 1936 as part of its expansion into large military and commercial aircraft. By December 7, 1941, it was already one of the most sophisticated aircraft manufacturing operations in the country. That was the problem. The Army's Western Defense Command assessed Plant 2 in the days after Pearl Harbor and recognized immediately what it was looking at: a catastrophic vulnerability sitting in plain view. The most important bomber factory in America was on Seattle's south waterfront, flat, enormous, identifiable on any map, visible from altitude to any navigator with basic skills. In early 1942, the threat of Japanese aircraft reaching the West Coast was not a settled question. Japanese submarines had already shelled Fort Stevens, Oregon, the previous June. The Army needed Plant 2 invisible. The solution Detley's team built was not modest in its ambition. They constructed an entire false neighborhood directly on the Plant 2 roof, approximately 26 acres of fake residential Seattle pressed down on an industrial ceiling. Lightweight structures were positioned to suggest houses, sized to keep the roof load manageable. Wire armatures and painted materials produced trees, convincing enough from bomber altitude. Stationary model cars sat on fake streets. Some local accounts claim that fake laundry lines were strung between structures to complete the domestic picture, though the precise construction details need verification against Army records. Nothing moved. Nothing was inhabited. But from 10,000 feet, there was no factory. What was happening below the fake neighborhood was an entirely different matter. The Duwamish River runs directly beside Plant 2. The same industrial geography, flat land, rail connections, river access that had made this stretch of East Marginal Way South ideal for a massive manufacturing plant in 1936 also made it a conduit. Materials arrived by rail and water. Finished aircraft components moved out the same way. Chemical processes ran continuously on the production floor in direct proximity to that river. In 1942, in the full urgency of wartime production, nobody at Boeing or in the Army was asking what the factory was putting into the Duwamish. That question would come much later. When it did, it would not be cheap. There was another rupture in December 1941 that no amount of chicken wire and painted fabric could address. In the days immediately after Pearl Harbor, Boeing dismissed its Japanese-American employees, workers who had been part of the production community, who had operated inside the plant before the Army declared it a military secret, were removed from the facility. The exact number affected needs verification in Boeing personnel records and in the archives of Japanese-American community organizations in Seattle. But the sequence is documented, and the contradiction is stark. Within weeks of removing workers because of their ancestry, the Army was constructing a fake residential suburb on the factory roof to deceive an Air Force representing people of that same ancestry. The factory's first act of concealment in this war was not made of wire and painted fabric. It happened at the gate. That was Boeing Plant 2 in the spring of 1942, a bomber factory below a fake neighborhood, a river running alongside both, a workforce already shaped by decisions it had no hand in making. The Army called the rooftop construction classified. The Duwamish received no such designation. By 1943, Boeing's Seattle workforce had grown to somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 people, depending on the source, and Plant 2 was the beating center of that number. Shift changes on East Marginal Way South looked less like a factory clock-out and more like a small city deciding to move simultaneously. Workers arrived before sunrise. Workers left after dark. The building never fully stopped. The B-17 Flying Fortress was in continuous production on the floor below the fake neighborhood, and the Army needed them faster than Boeing had ever built anything in its history. The B-17 was not a small object to produce. Nearly 75 feet long, with a wingspan over 100 feet, each aircraft was a precision assembly of hundreds of thousands of individual parts made from aluminum, steel, rubber, glass, and electronics. Building 1 required coordinated labor across every skill category Boeing employed: machinists, sheet metal workers, riveters, electricians, painters, inspectors. Then Boeing was building them in volume, at rates that some sources describe as exceeding a dozen aircraft per day at peak production, though the exact daily figure varies across sources and deserves verification against Boeing's own production records. What is not disputed is the cumulative output. Boeing Seattle was producing B-17 bombers at a pace that made it one of the most strategically significant manufacturing sites in the Allied war effort. Women moved into that production operation in substantial numbers. Boeing's wartime workforce in Seattle included thousands of female workers, not as symbolic representatives of the national mobilization, but as functional members of a factory running at maximum intensity. They worked beside male colleagues on the assembly line, in inspection, in fabrication. Their presence is documented in photographs held in the Museum of History and Industry in Seattle, and in the oral histories the museum and local historical societies collected over subsequent decades. They walked through the same gates, under the same fake neighborhood, doing the same work that was keeping the factory indispensable to the war. The International Association of Machinists represented a large portion of that workforce, and the Union Hall was part of the social architecture of the plant. Workers had leverage in wartime that they understood how to use carefully. Carefully because Boeing had government contracts it could not afford to lose, and workers had families who depended on the paycheck. The relationship between Boeing management and its unionized labor during the war was productive and tense in approximately equal measure. Everyone needed the factory to keep running. Georgetown and South Park, the neighborhoods immediately surrounding Plant 2, filled with that workforce's daily life. Diners and bars on the streets running off East Marginal Way South depended on shift timing, with breakfast crowds at 5 in the morning and dinner crowds at midnight. Local businesses measured their week by Boeing's payroll schedule. Workers rented rooms and houses in Georgetown. Families who had moved to Seattle specifically for Boeing work settled in South Park. The neighborhoods grew with the factory. The economic relationship that looks, from a distance, like a city benefiting from a major employer looked, from closer, like something more specific. Almost everything around that factory was organized around the assumption that the factory would continue. The Duwamish River ran beside all of it. It was not invisible to the people who lived near it. Duwamish tribe members had fished this river long before Boeing existed, long before Seattle existed, and they continued to fish it during the war years. The river was a food source and a cultural constant for the tribe. The contamination accumulating in the riverbed during peak production was not visible from the bank. Solvents, degreasers, industrial chemicals, the byproducts of large-scale metal fabrication. These things do not announce themselves. They move into sediment slowly, in quantities that only become measurable over time. The war ended in 1945. The fake neighborhood on the roof came down, probably in stages as Japanese air capacity over the continental United States collapsed in 1944 and early 1945. The rooftop was stripped of its wire trees, its stationary cars, its painted streets. The illusion had served its purpose, or had never needed to. No Japanese aircraft ever reached Seattle in any force capable of targeting Plant 2. Detley's neighborhood fooled no one who ever actually appeared to be fooled. The Army could not have known that in 1942, so the project cannot be called a waste. But the fake suburb lasted perhaps 3 years and left nothing behind. The factory lasted decades longer. It continued producing after the camouflage came down, its mission shifting with the post-war aerospace market. The roof now showed what it was, an industrial ceiling over a production floor. But the building continued to receive materials, run chemical processes, and operate beside the Duwamish. The river continued to receive what the factory produced. The difference was that in peacetime, nobody was calling Plant 2 a military emergency. Nobody was calling the river a problem either. That was the structure of the trap. The urgency that made everyone look at the roof had never directed anyone to look at the water. In 2001, the Environmental Protection Agency designated the Lower Duwamish Waterway a federal Superfund site. The designated segment ran 5.5 miles. The primary contaminants documented in the riverbed sediment included PCBs, arsenic, dioxins, carcinogenic polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and trichloroethylene. These are not unusual industrial byproducts. They are the chemical record of what large-scale metal fabrication, degreasing, painting, and manufacturing produce when they operate beside a river for decades without systematic controls on discharge. The Duwamish did not become contaminated because of one decision or one event. It became contaminated because the factory beside it ran continuously, and the river was simply there to receive what the factory generated. The EPA identified 4 potentially responsible parties: Boeing, the City of Seattle, King County, and the Port of Seattle. All 4 had contributed to the contamination through different pathways: manufacturing discharge, storm drain overflow, and industrial operations. Boeing, as the largest manufacturer with the longest continuous presence beside the river, carried the largest share of responsibility. The initial cleanup cost estimate published in the EPA's 2013 Record of Decision was approximately $342 million. That figure has been revised upward since. The cleanup that the Superfund designation required was projected to cost more than anything the Army spent hiding the factory in the first place, more than the wire trees, more than the fake cars, more than every painted fake street Detley's team installed on a rooftop that fooled no enemy and left no damage behind. The Duwamish tribe has been part of the remediation process since the beginning, and not as a minor stakeholder. Their relationship with the river predates Boeing's founding, predates Seattle's incorporation, predates the industrial transformation of the South Waterfront by generations. When the EPA began working through the cleanup framework, the tribe brought the oldest continuous claim to the river's health to a table otherwise occupied by a corporation, 2 municipal governments, and a port authority. The contamination had made fish consumption from the Duwamish unsafe in quantities the tribe had relied upon for centuries. Fish consumption advisories, government signs, posted along the river, stating how many meals of locally caught fish are considered safe per month, became the most visible physical evidence that the story was not finished. Those signs are still posted. They can be read today. South Park and Georgetown, the neighborhoods that grew up around Plant 2's workforce, carried a disproportionate share of the health burden. These communities, many of their residents lower income, many of them communities of color, lived closest to the contamination zone. They had not made the production decisions. They had not designed the discharge pathways. They had organized their lives around the factory's payroll and then were left beside its chemical legacy after the payroll moved elsewhere. Environmental justice assessments of the lower Duwamish corridor have documented the concentration of that burden in these specific neighborhoods. The distance between where the decisions were made and where the consequences landed is one of the clearest measurements in the whole story. Boeing Plant 2 was demolished. The building that once held B-17 production, that once wore a fake residential neighborhood on its roof, that once employed tens of thousands of people on East Marginal Way South, came down approximately between 2010 and 2012. The production work had long since migrated to Boeing's Renton facility for the 737, to the enormous Everett plant for wide-body aircraft. Plant 2 had not been killed by a BRAC commission or a congressional vote. It had been made irrelevant by the company's own expansion into newer, larger, more modern facilities. It ended not with a fight, but with a transfer of purpose from active production to vacant property, and then with demolition equipment. The building is gone. The ground beneath its footprint is not clean. The fake neighborhood Detley built lasted roughly 3 years. The contamination the factory generated took 59 years to receive a formal federal designation, and the cleanup it requires has not been completed. The camouflage was designed to make something invisible. It worked for a few years over a threat that never materialized. The factory's chemical output also remained invisible for far longer over a consequence that was entirely real. The aerial photograph still exists. Boeing's historical archives hold it. The Museum of History and Industry in Seattle has documented the camouflage story, and the images have been widely reproduced in books, in exhibitions, online. The fake neighborhood designed for maximum wartime secrecy became one of the most publicly shared images of Seattle's role in the Second World War. Detley's illusion, built to be seen by no one, is now seen by everyone. Look at the photograph again. The fake houses, the wire trees, the streets that led nowhere. In the lower portion of the frame, barely visible, the Duwamish River runs alongside the building. That is where the other secret went.